Read one book a day, and tonight we're diving into Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. Have you ever looked back on your growth in a quiet late night and suddenly realized that you once lived in standard answers for a long time? Expected to be an obedient child, a qualified member of society, disciplined to like what you should like, and choose a life that's approved. Even the emotional stirrings in your heart have to be secretly examined to see if they meet the worldly standards. When your true self collides with these established frameworks, has that sense of fragmentation and helplessness ever kept you tossing and turning? This timeless British classic we're sharing tonight holds the answer to this struggle. It's Jeanette Winterson's semi-autobiographical debut novel, which won the Whitbread Award for a first novel immediately after its publication in 1985. With delicate brushstrokes, it depicts the pain and awakening of individuals seeking self in the face of discipline, becoming a source of growth comfort for generations of Britons. The girl you are about to meet is also named Jeanette, sharing the same name as the author of this book, and this is no simple coincidence. It's Winterson stamping her own life's mark deeply into the narrative, making every line feel as real as a breath. Adopted by a pair of devout Pentecostal believers when she was only 5 months old, her adoptive mother became the heaviest shadow of her childhood, stubborn and fanatical, regarding her own faith as the sole truth, and wholeheartedly wanting to raise Jeanette to be a missionary. For Jeanette, home was never a warm haven, but rather a cage sealed shut by religious doctrine. Can you try to feel that suffocation? Not a single secular novel could be found in the house, no cheerful ballad could be heard, and even the laughter and playfulness inherent in a child's nature were regarded as blasphemy against God. The words of the Bible were her only bedtime stories, and church prayers and sermons fill her entire childhood schedule. In fact, when she was little, Jeanette sincerely embraced this kind of life. For a child whose worldview was not yet formed, the kingdom of God depicted by her adoptive mother was the entire world she could touch. She would earnestly practice the tone of preaching with her adoptive mother, memorize the stories in the Bible thoroughly, and even take the initiative to help with church activities, just to get an approving look from her adoptive mother and a praise from the pastor. You are God's good child. At that time, the concept of rebellion didn't exist in her heart at all. There was only complete obedience, just like the oranges that were always on the family dining table, fixed, common, and endowed with the symbolic meanings of purity and redemption by her adoptive mother. She took it for granted that this was the only correct fruit in the world, just as her life could only follow one correct path: to become a missionary. She didn't know that beyond oranges, there were sweet and sour strawberries, soft bananas, and crisp and sweet apples in the world, just as she didn't know that there were countless ways to live a life. The first crack in this taken-for-granted mindset came from a secular book that accidentally entered her world. One day, she lingered in front of a second-hand bookstore stall on the street corner, and a novel with a worn cover caught her eye. The stories in the book were completely different from what her adoptive mother had told her. There was no absolute good or evil, no unbreakable dogmas, and everyone could choose their life according to their own will. At that moment, it was as if something hard in her heart was quietly pried loose, like a dormant seed suddenly feeling the sunshine and rain. She secretly tucked the book into her clothes and took it home, reading by the faint light of a desk lamp. Every night after her adoptive mother fell asleep, building her own little world in the words. At this time, her heart was filled with a tearing contradiction. On the one hand, she relied too much on her adoptive mother's love, fearing that her transgression would be discovered, that she would be rejected by the church and lose her only sense of belonging. On the other hand, those fresh ideas grew like vines in her heart, making her doubt for the first time. Was the truth that her adoptive mother spoke of really the only one? If secular books were the faint light that made her doubt, then meeting Melanie was the flood that pushed her into complete opposition with the world. Melanie was another girl in the church, with gentle eyes and a smile that hid the same loneliness as hers. Two children raised in discipline, like two young saplings, keeping each other warm in the cold winter, soon had a strong resonance. This resonance slowly fermented into an ignorant yet sincere love. When Jeanette first realized that she liked Melanie, her heart was completely submerged by panic. Can you feel that fear? The church's doctrines echoed in her ears like a curse. Homosexuality is a heinous sin, an act abhorred by God. Those who are stained with sin will go to hell. Countless late nights she curled up in bed, repeatedly questioning herself. Is this really a sin? Why does she feel an unprecedented warmth and peace when she is with Melanie? This feeling is so real. How could it be wrong? She tried her best to hide this feeling, but paper can never wrap up fire. People in the church discovered their secret, and her peaceful life was shattered in an instant. The pastor called them to the church, stood on the high pulpit, and reprimanded their sin in a cold and harsh tone, every word lashing at them like a whip. Her adoptive mother stood aside, crying bitterly, shouting while crying, "You have defiled the cultivation I gave you, defiled the glory of God." The days that followed were hell for Jeanette. She was forced to undergo an exorcism ritual. The pastor waved a cross in front of her eyes, chanting obscure prayers, trying to drive out the evil spirits in her body. She was also required to publicly confess and admit her mistakes in front of all the congregation. When she stood in the center of the crowd, looking at those once familiar faces filled with disgust and contempt, and listening to their harsh words accusing her, the pain and confusion in her heart almost swallowed her. She didn't understand. She just fell in love with someone, just wanted to have a sincere feeling. So why did she have to endure such punishment? Her adoptive mother still made efforts to save her, locking her at home, confiscating all the forbidden books she could access, and not allowing her to have any contact with Melanie. Every day, her adoptive mother would sit beside her, reading the doctrines in the Bible over and over again, trying to make her return to the right path. But by this time, Jeanette's inner rebellion had been completely awakened. Looking at her adoptive mother's paranoid face and her bloodshot eyes from anxiety, she suddenly realized hidden in her adoptive mother's love was a fatal constraint. The church's doctrines were nothing but chains that kidnapped human nature. She looked at the birds flying freely outside the window, and a voice in her heart became clearer and clearer. I can never be the person they expect me to be, just as an orange can never become an apple. She began to refuse to confess, refused to accept the so-called redemption, because she finally understood that true redemption was never about catering to others' expectations, but about bravely accepting her true self. All contradictions finally erupted completely in a public sermon. That day, the church was full of people. The pastor called Jeanette to the stage and asked her to confess her sins in front of everyone and promised to reform herself. Jeanette stood on the stage, looking at the dense crowd below, and the eyes of her adoptive mother filled with both expectation and anxiety, and took a deep breath. Instead of confessing as the pastor required, she raised her head and said a passage that shocked everyone in a clear and firm voice. She questioned the church's doctrines and the dogmas that were regarded as truth. She told everyone, "I love Melanie. This feeling is not wrong. Like any sincere love, it is worthy of respect." As soon as she finished speaking, the church was in an uproar. Some people shouted angrily, some whispered in panic, and her adoptive mother fell straight down and fainted on the spot. Jeanette stood on the stage, watching the chaos in front of her, and there was no fear in her heart, only a sense of peace after liberation. After this outburst, Jeanette was completely abandoned by her family and the church. When her adoptive mother woke up, her eyes looking at her were full of cold disappointment. She said, "You are no longer my daughter. You are a sinner of God." The church also officially expelled her, declaring her abandoned by God. At the age of 16, Jeanette, covered in scars, left the home where she had lived for more than 10 years. The moment she walked out of the house, she looked back at the familiar house. The chimney on the roof was still smoking, but it was no longer her home. There was pain and reluctance in her heart. After all, this place carried all her childhood memories and the rare warmth from her adoptive mother. But more of it was a sense of liberation, like breaking free from the chains that had bound her for a long time. She knew that from this moment on, she had to face this unfamiliar world alone and find her own path, even if the road ahead was full of thorns. The days after leaving home were harder than she had imagined. She had no money and no place to live, so she could only barely settle down in a cheap rental house. To survive, she did all kinds of odd jobs, washing dishes in the back kitchen of a restaurant where the cold water turned her hands pale, working as a cashier in a supermarket, standing for more than 10 hours a day until her waist ached and her back hurt, distributing leaflets on the street, being coldly rejected by passers-by, and even suffering from white eyes and scolding. When she was extremely tired, she would sit in a quiet corner, watching the passing crowd, and her heart was full of loneliness and confusion. She couldn't help but think of her adoptive mother's past kindness, the sweaters she knitted for her when she was a child, and the way she stayed by her bed when she was sick. She also thought of those once warm moments in the church the days when she sang with fellow believers, she began to doubt her choice. Was she really wrong? Was someone as different as her really unable to gain a foothold in this world? Many late nights, she curled up in the cold rental house, listening to the howling wind outside the window, and loneliness and grievance welled up in her heart, making her cry involuntarily. But even though life was so hard, she never gave up. She still insisted on reading, using all the money she saved to buy books, and finding strength in the words. She began to take the initiative to meet more different people, stepping out of the once closed small circle. She found that the world was far more diverse than she had imagined. Some people didn't believe in religion, but still lived a kind and fulfilling life. Some people chose love that was not recognized by the world, but still lived happily. Some people gave up stable jobs to pursue what they loved and also found their own value. It turned out that love had many forms, and each was worthy of respect. It turned out that the correct way of life was never the only one. In this process, she also met many warm people. The kind boss in the restaurant would give her an extra bowl of hot soup when she was hungry. Like-minded book friends in the bookstore would discuss the stories in the books with her and share their insights. The gentle female teacher at school discovered her writing talent and encouraged her to pursue her dream. The appearance of these people was like beams of light in the dark, illuminating her path forward and making her know that she was not alone. So she began to try writing. She wrote her experiences, thoughts, confusion, and awakening into words, word by word. For her, writing was not for fame, but a kind of healing and self-redemption. When she wrote down the pain and confusion in her heart, those heavy emotions seemed to dissipate along with it. When she wrote down her awakening and growth, she also understood herself more clearly. Through writing, she sorted out her inner thoughts, accepted her past, and slowly found her own value. She no longer felt inferior because of her sexual orientation, and no longer felt lonely because she was abandoned by her family and the church. She finally understood that her value did not need to be proven by others' recognition. Her life did not need to be lived according to others' expectations. Just as an orange is not the only fruit, she was not the only standard life. She could have her own shape, her own taste, and her own path. At the end of the story, Jeanette did not return to the home that had abandoned her, nor did she rejoin the church. She still lived alone and firmly moved forward on the path of writing. Although there was no real reconciliation between her and her adoptive mother, the once sharp confrontation had diminished. Once she returned to her hometown and specially went to visit her adoptive mother. Pushing open the door, she saw her adoptive mother's aged face. Her once straight back had become hunched, and her eyes had lost the fanaticism of the past, replaced by a bit of tiredness and loneliness. When her adoptive mother saw her, she did not accuse her or speak. She just silently walked into the kitchen and handed her an orange. At that moment, Jeanette looked at the orange in her hand and suddenly understood. Her adoptive mother was also a person bound by dogma. Her paranoia and stubbornness were just the only way she knew to understand the world. She had lived in her own faith all her life and had never really seen the outside world. But she herself had broken free from that constraint and found her own path. And that was enough. I wonder if you have noticed that in the novel's narrative, in addition to Jeanette's real growth trajectory, there are also many independent fairy tales and fables interspersed. The legend of the Holy Grail, the story of King Arthur, the fable of Jonah and the whale, and so on. These stories seem unrelated to the main line, but in fact, they are all reflections of Jeanette's inner world and another expression of her spiritual world. When she was a child, these fairy tales were her refuge to escape the discipline of reality. When she was overwhelmed by her adoptive mother's strict requirements, she would seek comfort in the world of fairy tales. When she was confused, these fairy tales were her guide to find answers. She would look for fates similar to her own in the stories and find the strength to move forward. When she awakened, these fairy tales were her weapon to resist dogma. She would interpret different meanings from the stories to support her choices. For example, the story of Jonah and the whale corresponds to her experience of being swallowed by the church and finally reborn. The story of King Arthur's search for the Holy Grail corresponds to her process of seeking self-identity. The interweaving of these fairy tales and reality makes the whole story more layered, clarifies Jeanette's psychological trajectory, and allows you to deeply understand every choice and every growth of her. There are many symbolic details in the book that are worth savoring carefully. In addition to the oranges we mentioned repeatedly before, there is also the image of the tiger. Tigers often appear in Jeanette's dreams and imaginations. This tiger is actually her true inner self, wild, passionate, and untamable, the instinct of her to resist discipline. When she was a child, she was afraid of this tiger and wanted to suppress it because she thought this untamable nature was wrong. When she grew up, she slowly accepted this tiger and understood that this was her most real appearance. It was this untamable nature that gave her the courage to resist and the strength to seek herself. There is also the image of the name. Jeanette was once labeled with many tags: God's good child, believer, sinner. These tags defined her identity and also bound herself. When she finally found herself, she truly had her own name, not a tag given by others, but a real, complete, and undefined self. In the whole story, the relationship between Jeanette and her adoptive mother is probably the most sigh-worthy part. Was there love between them? Of course there was. Her adoptive mother would knit thick sweaters for her in winter to resist the cold in Lancashire. She would stay by her bed all night to take care of her when she was sick. She would leave all the things she thought were the best for her. But this love was distorted by rigid dogma, becoming heavy and suffocating. Her adoptive mother loved her, but she loved the God in her heart more and loved those so-called doctrines more. She loved Jeanette in the way she thought was correct, but she never asked what Jeanette really wanted, nor did she really listen to the voice in her heart. And Jeanette once relied deeply on her adoptive mother's love, taking this love as her only support, until this love became a constraint and she had to choose to leave. The conflict between them was never a personal grudge, but the opposition between two values, confrontation between a diverse self and a single discipline, and the collision between vivid human nature and rigid dogma. This collision is distressing and thought-provoking. On the surface, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is a story about a girl's growth and resistance, but deep down, it hides a profound inquiry into human nature, faith, and self-identity. Jeanette's experience is not only her own, but also a microcosm of countless people struggling in discipline and seeking self in confusion. The core theme of this book is to break the myth of the only. There is no only truth, no only faith, no only love, and no only way of life. In that era when religious dogma prevailed and social concepts were conservative, Jeanette's resistance was difficult but brave. Her experience tells us that rigid faith is never a panacea for redemption, but a chain that binds human nature. True faith is not blind obedience or catering, but sincere acceptance of oneself and the world. True redemption is not becoming the person others expect, but becoming one's true self. The church and family in the book symbolize the systems and groups that try to shape everyone into a standard image. They are afraid of differences, reject diversity, and kidnap everyone's life with a single value. Jeanette's resistance is to break free from this kidnapping and defend the diverse self. Looking at today, this book still has a strong practical significance. We live in an era that seems diverse and open, but the anxiety of the only still exists. We are still kidnapped by family expectations. You should find a stable job. You should get married and have children at the right age. You should live a life envied by others. We are still bound by social standards. Success is defined as having a house and a car. The template for happiness is a happy family. The correct choice is to follow the path of the public. We often lose ourselves in these shoulds and feel anxious under the gaze of others, just like Jeanette when she was a child, thinking that oranges are the only fruit and obedience is the only choice. The inspiration that this book gives us is to learn to accept difference, accept our own differences and the differences of others. Everyone is a unique individual with the right to choose their own way of life and pursue the happiness they think. Just as an orange is not the only fruit, an apple has its sweetness, a banana has its softness, and a strawberry has its sourness. Each taste is worthy of respect. We don't have to force ourselves to become the person others expect, nor do we have to feel inferior because of our differences. True self-identity is not catering to others, but accepting all of ourselves, including our strengths and our imperfections, including our mainstream and our minority traits. At the same time, this book also makes us rethink the boundary between love and discipline. Many times, people around us will discipline us in the name of love. Parents interfere with our choices in the name of for your own good. Friends judge our lives in the name of caring about you. Society sets our trajectory in the name of thinking about you. But true love is never control or constraint, but respect and tolerance. Just as Jeanette finally understood, love should make each other a better version of themselves, not make each other the person the other expects. In addition, this book also explores the relationship between loneliness and growth. Jeanette's path of growth was a lonely one. A Abandoned by her family and the church, she had to face the hardships of life alone and sort out the confusion in her heart alone. But it was this loneliness that gave her the opportunity to listen to the voice in her heart and truly understand herself. Many times, growth is a lonely practice. We need to settle ourselves in loneliness, find strength in loneliness, and complete our self-awakening in loneliness. Loneliness is not terrible. What's terrible is losing ourselves in loneliness and blindly catering to others to escape loneliness. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is a gentle yet brave book. It tells us that no matter what kind of discipline and constraints we are in, we have the right to choose to be our true selves. No matter what kind of confusion and loneliness we face, we have the courage to find our own path. It is like a light in the late night, illuminating the direction of our progress and warming our tired hearts. I hope tonight's sharing can make you have more acceptance of yourself and more courage for life before bed. No summary can replace the original work. A good book is worth reading page by page. Good night, and wish you a sound sleep tonight. I'm time for bed. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to our next encounter.